Airing first on Asheville FM, WSFM LP 103.3 FM in Asheville, this is The Final Straw, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian radio show broadcasting out of occupied Cherokee land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world. This week on The Final Straw, we're featuring two audios from folks based in the Triangle area of North Carolina. First, we'll hear graduate student and anti-racist activists Maya Little speak about their research into the racist history of urban development and neo-Confederate symbols in and around Chapel Hill and Carrboro, North Carolina. Maya also speaks about the recent resistance to the specific statue called Silent Sam at UNC Chapel Hill, and the far-right and cop repression faced by students and anti-racist activists to push for and eventually autonomously enact its removal. Maya can be found on Twitter at Reed Kropotkin and contributes writing to the project Cuddlepot Mag, which is at Cuddlepot Mag. Then Dwayne Dixon, an adjunct professor of cultural anthropology at UNC and an anti-racist activist, talks about personal experiences of coming up in a white military family in the U.S., experiences of struggle against white supremacists and their symbols in the so-called U.S. South in recent years, and the inspirational strength of those struggles interlacing and expanding into ecological defense, anti-ICE work, anti-police brutality work, disaster response, and the building of autonomous anti-capitalist community infrastructures. To check out a project that Dwayne is involved in, you can go to Fedbook and seek out Piedmont Red Strings, which is linked in our show notes. A brief content warning, as the episode is about white supremacist violence perpetrated on black bodies. To hear a couple of announcements, stay tuned to the end of the episode. The Final Straw Radio is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts. Here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
I'm going to make those pompous academics regret kicking out such a genius. Deciding to build my lab and do my research.
The Time Talks Podcast.
Have you ever stared at a 500-page book and wish you could just talk to the author about their ideas instead? If so, the Time Talks Podcast, part of the Channel Zero network, is for you, where we discuss history, politics, music, and art with an anti-authoritarian and anarchist perspective.
The Time Talks Podcast.
What's this light? I feel different.
The Time Talks Podcast.
And now some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what? We'll come like a blood.
Progress. The idea of progress is central to the civilization program. It's the engine of our larger culture, the centerpiece of our human narrative, our mythology. It's kind of a no-brainer that we're moving through time, that yesterday we were in one state of being, and today we're in another. All living things go from experience to experience. But this concept of progress gives the sense that collectively, humanity is moving from an inferior state to a superior one. Progress gives us the sense that we're moving through history and that we have some date with destiny, that we're working out the kinks, and that we will eventually arrive at some golden destination, the grand achievement of all of our labor over the centuries. It will be quite a moment. We'll hold hands and sing Kumbaya, bunny rabbits and rainbows, fairy dust and magical beans. Our farts will smell like Cinnabons and fountains will flow with liquid chocolate. The concept of progress infects every element of our civilized thinking. We learn evolution in school, for example. We see the visual aid that's stuck to the wall in biology class in public schools, one that shows a male humanoid as he developed over time. The first one is short and hairy and hunched over. Then each successive specimen gets taller and less hairy and has slightly better posture. The last specimen, of course, wears a suit and carries a briefcase. He's white. He's well manicured. So the message is pretty clear. We have, after trial and error, and a great deal of struggle through history, finally arrived at the stage for which we were destined. We started off hairy and stinky and fornicating in the mud, and now we're well-groomed and smell of expensive cologne, and we perform our reproductive activity in waterbeds in the privacy of suburban bedrooms with air conditioning and big-screen TVs. Progress. We are making progress. Things are getting better. We are closer to our grand destination. Please stand by. As card-carrying members of civilization, as participants in this fantastic human epic, we don't question the narrative of progress. We don't critically analyze our cultural mythology. In fact, we don't even use words like mythology to describe our concept of progress, because to use words like mythology would be to somehow imply that we're not on this steady march forward to a great and awesome future that only we humans with our big, big brains can bring about. We don't question whether we're making progress. That would be silly. Clearly, things are changing rapidly. We're developing new technologies and our population is booming, and we have all of these advancements in science and medicine and so on. We daily witness new developments on our march into the future. We're clearly getting closer to our grand destination. Please stand by. But if we were going to get silly, and if we were going to use words like mythology, we might, in some moment of madness, ask ourselves, is what we experience really progress? Is our collective situation getting better? You know, because progress doesn't just mean we're moving in any old direction. Progress means improvement, moving from an inferior state to a superior one. So for the narrative of civilization to be true, for our cultural mythology to be valid, things would have to be getting better rather than worse, right? Okay, so let me be the one to just throw this out there. Are things getting better? I think perhaps that we may have gotten lost. We may have proverbially lost the forest for the trees, as the saying goes. I suspect that our concept of progress has misled us. The problem is the way that we view this concept of progress with our swivelized minds. We've gotten lost in the immediate moment, and we've lost track of the end goal, the final destination. We don't speak of progress in terms of getting closer to our destined world of peace and prosperity and joy, but we think of progress in terms of taking the immediate challenges that confront us. So we collectively push buttons and pull levers and flip switches in response to these immediate challenges, and we perceive that what we've done serves as a solution. If we can't get food to that village, for example, we decide to build a road. And if we can't create a route around that hill, we blast it with dynamite and put the road through the middle of it. Problem solved. Progress made. But we don't consider the mudslides that will cover the road. So we have to put up fences. Problem solved. Progress made. So with the fences up, wild boars can't get out of the roadway. And drivers swerve to avoid them and cause wrecks. Over time, we lose far more folks to wild boar accidents than we would have lost if everyone in the village had starved before we built that road. And yet we conceive of what we do as progress because we are, myopically, solving problems. And we therefore must be moving forward toward a superior state of existence rather than an inferior one. We don't stop to ask whether the things we perceive as solutions are really creating greater and greater problems. Consider, we've been on this road of progress for 8,000 years and counting. We've been on a steady march to our grand destination. What is that destination, by the way? What does this world of peace and prosperity and happiness and security even look like? Will we know it when we finally arrive there? We don't really know. We've lost our vision of that end goal. I would suggest that it is very difficult to hit a target if you're no longer aiming at it. We're no longer aiming at the final destination. I would also suggest that after 8,000 years of this progress, after 8,000 years of swivelizing, of reshaping our world, we should be able at this point to give some kind of projection as to when we're going to perfect this thing. We should by now have some sort of timetable for when we're going to arrive at peace and prosperity, at happiness and security. Are we going to get there in 2021 or in 2034? When exactly are we going to arrive at Komb'oa, holding hands and singing joyfully? That final destination to which we're progressing. When we get there, we can stop passing laws because we'll have them just right. And we can stop trading on Wall Street because everyone will have exactly what they want. There'll be no wars, no hunger, no crime. How far away are we? Where are we at 8,000 years down the road to this destination? And how long do we still have? If we can't answer those questions, then perhaps this concept of progress is false. Maybe civilization is not taking us to a greater destination. Maybe instead of things getting better and better, they really are getting worse and worse. And if we don't stop, if we don't finally reject this false mythology of progress and abandon the civilization program, we'll bring about worse and worse until it finally cannot get worse. Maybe our very survival depends on rejecting this mythology of progress. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain in exile from Ohio at Buckingham Correctional in Dillon, Virginia. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can write to Sean Swain at his latest address at Sean Swain, number 2015638, Buckingham Correctional, 1349 Correctional Center Road, Dillwyn, Virginia, 23936. You can find his past writings, recordings of his audio segments, and updates on his case at seanswain.org.
Graduate student worker next year again at UNC Chapel Hill. A lot of the work I've been doing in Chapel Hill since I've been there, I guess these last almost 3 years, has been around Confederate monuments and the racist, the white supremacist built landscape and revealing truths about Chapel Hill and its institutions through that landscape. That's not something that I started or that the toppling of Silent Sam started, but has been something that's been going on at UNC since at least 1960, I would say, in like documented history kind of ways. So I just wanted to start with the statue, which I think is kind of familiar to everyone, even Confederate statues, and just like what, maybe in terms of like art and history and symbolism and all these things that we look at. So this statue was erected in 1913 by the Daughters of the Confederacy. That was a group of prominent, wealthy descendants of Confederate generals. And those are the same people who became industrialists, people who built up a lot of the factory's infrastructure and had a vested interest in also disciplining predominantly black workers to work in those places. For instance, I'm going to talk about Julian Carr, who dedicated the statue. There's a town right next to Chapel Hill named Komb'oa, which was named from him. He was an industrialist and he brought lights to Chapel Hill. So, for me, like, one of the most prominent things about the statue is that, like many statues I've seen throughout my life in this country, it is like a statue of a young white man armed. And I think that goes across boundaries of Confederates and other things. And below is the depiction, symbolically, of the boy dropping his books to go do his duty. He's handed this duty by, like, Lady Confederacy, right? So all these messages on a college campus are very interesting. And now to talk about kind of the geography of it. Silent Sam faces north, but not only north, it faces the north end of Chapel Hill, which is historically a black neighborhood. And this neighborhood is a neighborhood in which people who built the campus as enslaved people, their descendants still live in and resided in when these things were happening. And so the kinds of, things in this landscape, which I think come very easily to a lot of black people I've talked to. Like a lot of the times when we were doing sit-ins, kids would come by, and it would take a lot to explain to like someone that like Silent Sam is racist, and that Silent Sam is like was built by people who were like, yeah, black people, you know. But for someone who has a lived experience in Chapel Hill, or in these landscapes where Confederate monuments are so common, I mean, that's a known thing. And resistance to Confederate monuments is not new. There are stories in New Orleans when Confederate monuments were erected in the 1920s, in which black residents, every time they passed by it, would like take a hammer to it, or paint it, or spit on it. So it's pretty clear what they represent, but what do they represent for a lot of the white people who claim them as heritage? What is the construction of that as well? So I'll get into that.
UNC, as well as the toppling of the Silent Sam Confederate Monument at the university campus last year.
I want to get into another thing about the statue because I think it comes into who has led a lot of the fight around this monumentation and this built landscape. And what we talk about when we talk about intersectionality and sitting at the sites of like intersections of oppression. So Julian Carr dedicated the statue. He was a Civil War veteran, a Confederate. He was involved in like white supremacist groups after the Civil War. He was like vested white supremacist dude. So he dedicated the speech partly with this kind of anecdote, and I'll do it. I think it's almost quote for quote, maybe. Upon my return from Appomattox, in full view of 100 Union soldiers, 100 yards from where we stand, I horsewhipped a Negro wench who fled to these university gates because upon the streets of this quiet village, she had insulted a Southern lady, so a Southern white woman. So for me, like hearing that, there's so much within that speech, so much within that, right? I mean, if you read the rest of the speech, this guy is like typical, like kind of like, you know, upper class white dude. He's talking about classics and all these illusions. And then all of a sudden, in this space where they're consecrating and dedicating the statue, he veers to talking about beating a black woman near the statue. A woman who fled to the university for protection, in fact. These aren't the only figures of white supremacy at UNC. There's 30 buildings that are named after former slave owners. The building in which the predominantly black UNC football team used to play in was named for William Keenan Sr., who led a militia that specifically used machine guns during the Wilmington riots, which were used on like a black neighborhood in Wilmington to suppress black voters. I think like hundreds were killed. So the UNC solution to that was to name it after his son. So it's now William Keenan Jr. Stadium. So yeah, that is like the kind of environment in which we were working in, which is a fundamentally untrue and irrational environment. Just another anecdote, just to kind of, again, there's a building, the history building is named Hamilton Hall. It's named for another famous white supremacist. At certain points, the university has found indigenous remains on campus, and they keep them in the basement of that building. And there's been negotiations for years with the campus indigenous group to recover those remains. And I asked, when I'm talking about all these things, to imagine what it's like to come to this university, having been told that the only way to make something of yourself as a black person, as an indigenous person, as a person of color is to go be a university student and study and live and work in the same buildings as people who would have lynched you and know that. So I want to get into like maybe some Chapel Hill history and like mythology again, because well, I guess going back to Silent Sam and like the construction of whiteness and white supremacy. So Nikita yesterday mentioned Bayard Rustin, who started the first freedom rides, integrated freedom rides. And he was arrested in Chapel Hill, and there was a mob, actually. Like, he couldn't stay in Chapel Hill during his trial and after he got arrested because there were people who, like, were threatening to kill him in Chapel Hill. Martin Luther King, similarly, when he came to Chapel Hill to talk, he wouldn't stay in Chapel Hill, he would stay in Durham because of, like, the fear of, like, what people, like, not having any defense, not having any system of, like, protection at all in Chapel Hill. And so that's the landscape we're working with, but we're also working with a notion of Chapel Hill has of itself as a place of enlightenment, of education. There's actually a famous quote by a historian, or a writer in Chapel Hill. So Chapel Hill fashions itself as a lighthouse that shines in the darkest regions of the South. But like any lighthouse, it's dark at its base. So these pictures are from some 1960s sit-ins in Chapel Hill. And these were pretty rebellious. Like this is Franklin Street. Franklin Street was stopped. People did sit-ins in front of, like in the parking lot of basketball games. And there was a lot of kind of competing images of what a Chapel Hill without white supremacy would look like. But resistance in Chapel Hill has a long history. And again, unlike Silent Sam, it's never portrayed. It's never a part of UNC. It's never a part of UNC culture. In fact, I didn't know about any of these things until maybe like a year ago, right? And then to get to another point to me, which is very interesting, in Chapel Hill, and I guess maybe here's a little off the course, but maybe it goes back to what we're up against as students at a university, working against the institutions of the university, especially students of color, are people who look like you and speak for the institution, speak for white supremacy. So I really like this photo because it's a photo from the sit-ins, and they specifically, strategically used black police officers to stop sit-ins in Chapel Hill, like in actually many places. One of the failures of COINTELPRO was the inability to actually infiltrate and gather information on black communities because police officers were predominantly white and were like seen as like not only like an enemy, very clearly. During this time, like in the late 1960s, across the country, but especially in places like Chapel Hill, more liberal cities, departments started to adopt black officers and even neglect black sheriffs. So how does that position at the university also in terms of like academics? So every time the chancellor had to talk about Silent Sam to black students, like every time black students were like, we're having a meeting, talk about Silent Sam, 2 administrators who were black would be dragged out. No one ever sees these people, ever. And so the chancellor doesn't even have to say anything. She doesn't have to defend Silent Sam. She doesn't have to do anything. Because 2 other people will do it for her. And the things that they say, one of the vice chancellors literally said, if you all have such a problem with Silent Sam, you shouldn't come here. You should just go to another university, go to a black university, if you can't stand it. And so I think also interestingly within the kind of community that was eventually made, which is a much more anti-authoritarian community now, is maybe a misunderstanding between a lot of the black student activists at UNC and people in the community who are more solidly anti-authoritarian in their politics. And they're kind of known beliefs in politics. And I think that comes from a lot of the chaos of being in a space in which the embodied experience is that you don't amount to anything until you are at this university. But you're only here because of an affirmative action. And this is a gift to you. Even though predominantly the labor that funds this university is done by black and brown people, right? The people who actually feed us, the people who clean the buildings, the people who clean the campus. And then on the other side, at a place like UNC, the people who play basketball, football, the sports that bring in a lot of money, receive nothing for that labor, except for a scholarship at the university. Within that frame, a lot of, I think, conversations could happen because I think, there's I don't know, to me, I, see it as a radio frequency kind of thing, a lot of static. A lot of misunderstanding. And I guess I wanted to open that up because maybe, afterward we can talk about that. But I'll continue. I just wanted to end with, talking about how that has changed. I think now there's a community of black undergrad activists who are much more working outside of institutional organizations at UNC. UNC actually has several black organizations because each one has been co-opted slowly by university leaders, and so then a new one starts. And because again, you're taught that this is a gift. But like every other student, regardless of race, coming out in this economy, when you come out, you're going to come out with debt, with no job, with almost nothing. And you are been displaced in a way from your community, and also you don't really fit into this institution. There's a really good quote by Fred Moten, who's an Afro-pessimist. It's that the university can never be a place of enlightenment. It can only be a refuge. So be a thief to the university. And I think that's something that people, maybe started to live by more at UNC.
This is The Final Straw, and I'm Bursts. You're listening to anti-racist activist and graduate student worker at UNC, Maya Little, talk about the racist built landscape of Chapel Hill. And
again, getting back to the notion that Silent Sam's never been protested, this is Silent Sam in 1968, the day after Martin Luther King was assassinated. So there's also this notion to me, I want to bring this up and I don't have a picture of the other one, but this notion that this kind of protest has only happened now. This is false. Also the notion that this protest only happens in cities, at universities, with college kids and urbanites and all these other kinds of things that are meant to say that in North Carolina at least, and with the rhetoric of outside agitators, that these are outsiders. These aren't real North Carolinians, these aren't real people of this state. Well, a couple of days before Silent Sam was toppled on August 20th, a Confederate monument in the main square of Salisbury, North Carolina, which is a very different atmosphere than Chapel Hill, was painted white. And that was the second time it was painted white. So this kind of type of protest is so actually existent and there. And one of the things that I really love about living in Chapel Hill and actually in the South is that there is so much resistance. And that a lot of the violence, especially the violence in erasing, is so persistent because of that. So this is in 2015, June 2015. Black Lives Matter, and who is Sandra Bland? This was after Sandra Bland was murdered. So this was removed immediately because the sight of Sandra Bland's name on the statue was more obscene than a Confederate statue. The statue has also been painted for less political things. The statue's been painted Carolina blue after basketball games, and it's been painted gold by like UNC Greensboro rivals. These are things that are historically documented, and actually, I like kind of had to bring up like and I didn't get to bring up in my trial actually because the judge didn't want to hear it, but I could have brought it up in my trial. So the notion of like pastime also, and what is a riot, what is like reckless. Black student leader, Mr. Bond's actually wrote an amazing poem about this, because in a place like UNC, I grew up also around Ohio State. After the big UNC games, there's like a fire set in the street. Like people turn over couches and climb up poles. And not only that, I mean, there are places on this campus where when you talk about sexual assault, when you talk about homophobia, that it happens there. And that is never considered a riot, or is never considered obscene. But then the name of a black person who's murdered is. And so again, like these actions do bring out and like reveal the irrationality of white supremacy, of the way in which the university functions, and then calls itself a place of enlightenment and learning. So Silent Sam's also always been a site of protest, specifically again like protest against racism. So this is a protest by Black Student Movement, which was originally a very revolutionary organization at UNC. Like many college organizations in the 1960s and 70s, was pushing for ethnic studies, for black professors, for reforms in local high schools. And this was a protest held after the murder of James Gates and William Murphy. I'll get to James Gates later, but I just want to kind of drive home the point that this has always been a site of protest and tension. And this is UNC housekeeper in 1997, protesting the still present work conditions at UNC. And so not only has this always been a site of protest, but the people who have, by and large, led to the protest have taken on the creative responsibility of using the landscape at UNC, again, to reveal truths about what happened on the ground. This is a reimagining of a hall that was specifically named for this person named, I think, William Saunders. And he was the leader of the KKK in North Carolina. It was specifically named to recognize him for doing that. And the university was like, no, we can't do this, we can't erase history. That'd be f***ed up. So students did two things. First thing they did is they put Hitler Hall. And they put really, obscene things on halls and been like, that's history. The university of course removed it and was like, no, it's different. Then they were like, well, why not name a building at UNC after a black woman? Why not name Hurston Hall after Zora Neale Hurston, who did a lot of her anthropological education at UNC and spent a lot of time around Chapel Hill. And what really I think pushed the university to actually change the name of the hall was the continual focus on Zora Neale Hurston. That was so not allowed that the university finally caved in and decided to name it Carolina Hall. So that's what it's named. But people kind of in protest still refer to it as Hurston Hall. The people who led this fight were by and large black undergrads, graduate student women, and queers. And I would call them anarchists or identify, or necessarily I don't think they would identify as anarchists, but I think a lot of the things that they're doing and reimagining are things that we are doing to create better futures as well. And to reimagine our landscapes. Cool. Again, just kind of playing on the university's inability to tell anything. So instead of, we put up a lot of contextualization signs, and the police would go and just take them out. So we just keep putting them down, and the police would take them out. And it was very, but if the university wants to contextualize things, it's always grounded in the past, right? This university is still not racist. It's not racist now, right? We'll talk about racism that happened in the early 20th century, but we can't talk about the fact that students have been beaten and pepper sprayed for protesting racism now. Another project that a number of anti-racist activists took on was because they say anarchists can't build anything. was making monuments to people at UNC who have never been memorialized. So this was to the Negro Lynch. She ran to this university for safety and for the color of her skin, was beaten at its gates. We fight in her name. These were like 200 pounds, and like they were just really beautiful. And this was put next to the Jefferson Davis Memorial Highway marker. And Chapel Hill decided to get rid of the Jefferson Davis Memorial Highway marker after it was sitting there for God knows how many years, because they decided that both monuments were unclaimed property that needed to be removed. So that's like the kind of irrational sense of like, just like hidden, like this, like the institutions revealing themselves for what they truly are. But not only that, this monument was stolen by neo-Confederates. And it's interesting because when neo-Confederates talk about their enemies, they say that our enemies are Antifa. Our enemies are like Abraham Lincoln or whatever. But when they actually attack things, they attack monuments to black people and to slaves. Because that's clearly actually what like they are against, is any kind of critique of white supremacy. This is a memorial to James Cates. In 1970, this young black activist lay bleeding to death in the pit, stabbed by members of a white supremacist gang. James Cates' blood is on our campus. We fight in his name. So I just want to talk about this. This was the only memorial that ever existed to James Cates. And it was placed in the pit the day of my honored court of appeal trial, which is in February. And the university could not stand the sight of it for even 24 hours. It was removed in the middle of the night. It was in the pit in the same place where James Cates was murdered. And I just want to talk about the story of James Cates because if there was any kind of just like very like, I'm just going to use the word bipartisan or whatever, mission to memorialize someone, it would be someone like James Cates. James Cates was 22 when he was murdered. He was a Chapel Hillian. He was a part of Chapel Hill's first integrated high school class. And he wasn't simply a bystander. He was someone who was an active participant in sit-ins. He was an active participant in anti-racist activism at that time. So when he was murdered, it wasn't a random murder. It was white supremacists actively attacking the people fighting against racism. So he grew up in, I guess, in North End in Chapel Hill. His mother actually worked in the university laundry for very low wages. His cousin worked in the dining unit at the university and actually found him, saw him bleeding out, and was not allowed to remove him by the UNC police. The UNC police would not let anyone take him to a hospital, and they actually allowed him to bleed out to death. So, I mean, this, to me, story is so representative of the many ways in which Chapel Hill and UNC interacts with the black community around it, and continues to. And so it becomes especially depressing because, you know, this young man was killed by white supremacist bikers, and almost 50 years later, this is like what we're dealing with. Like the people like armed bikers from out of town coming to UNC and shaking hands with like the pigs because of course they know where their sympathies lie. I think it's like, as someone who studies history, to me it's so interesting in which like the ways in which like actually revealing this history, which most students at UNC don't know, would like, I don't know, cause so much of like a sense of uproar about this. But like how, I don't know, without like any prompting, like the forms of white supremacy at UNC haven't even changed that much. Like they're still entrenched in and they still exist in like, you know, how they were 50 years ago. And that can be kind of depressing. I think I maybe should talk about like what I was trying to do and like the strategy behind what I was doing. This was April 30th, 2018. So over a year ago. So I've been doing like sit-ins, like a daily sit-in, like informational sit-in at Silent Sam for a whole year. And that was mostly to make it like a contested space. Because Silent Sam is like this like big monument that sits at the front of campus that people like take pictures in front of, and they're like, you know? And just like making it a site in which like people couldn't do that, or when they had to like, I don't know, go and do their whole thing with Silent Sam, they had to like look at people being like, this is racist, and deal with that. Created like a lot of conflict for UNC. Like UNC had to spend a lot of money They had police on like McCorkle Place, like maybe like 100 feet from us at all times, 24 hours a day. That was mostly to stop us from like maybe saying anything that was too offensive to white alumni. But it just became like a ridiculous kind of thing, like the spectacle of all of it. So at a certain point, it's like, what does Silent Sam mean? What does he stand for? Silent Sam is about like stands on a foundation of black blood and black English. Like the Confederacy fought to enslave black people. For a system of oppression. Not even just black blood. Like this mythology around Silent Sam's construction. Silent Sam tells us nothing about deserters. He tells us nothing about the many men who were hung for treason because they refused to fight. North Carolinians who actually took to sabotaging the Confederacy. In my eyes, it's necessary to reveal the blood and guts of like Silent Sam. And also, with this kind of like magical thing with blood, like once you put blood or bodily fluids on something, then it becomes like a bodily fluid thing. So it becomes a little gross, which is kind of cool when you like don't like something. So covered Silent Sam in ink and some of my own blood. I was arrested immediately. Statue was sprayed immediately. Yeah, I was convicted and given like a prayer for justice continued, which is in North Carolina means like you're guilty, but you don't have like a sentence technically. Entered, unless you up again. So, yeah, I don't know what to say much more about my action. I think some of you have heard about it. To move on to August 20th, 2018, this was the night before the first day of classes. And this is the night that Silent Sam was toppled. And I think one of the major things about that night was just creating, gone from revealing truths, gone from trying to recover things from the past, but now to reimagining a better future and recovering other black activists and students and community activists imaginings of a better future. And that just says as simple to us as as simple as covering up Silent Sam, remembering the dead who were not even allowed to remember. So just to talk about the banners, I think the first one is a speech by Julian Carr. That's in the front actually, so that's the one that fell. Second one for a world without white supremacy. The third one is the list of names, an incomplete list, obviously because it's all the documented names, not even all the documented names of people of color murdered by white supremacy in this general area around North Carolina. So that includes people like Lamont Scott, Jesus Huerta, and Durham. 3 recorded lynchings in Orange County. They're not memorialized, and the county's currently having a battle over prisoners in the Durham jail who died from medical neglect. 3 students, 3 Muslim students who were murdered by white supremacists in Chapel Hill. Actually, someone who broke, literally came into their home and shot them all to death. And this is a campus that actually was going to have was going to force its religious and specifically Islamic studies program to cooperate with the U.S. military to provide information for counterterrorism. So these are the kind of things that exist, and it's so overwhelming. And just to portray it, just to even talk about it, becomes something that's rebellious. And so I guess a new McCorkle Place was imagined that night, and Silent Sam was brought down. Woo! And there have been quite a lot of debates about what to do with Silent Sam. A lot of work after was just along with legal kind of stuff, but just continuing to put pressure on the university. And also continuing to expose them for what they were. They proposed a $5.3 million shrine to Silent Sam, 3 minutes from a synagogue, and part of campus. Campus is still relatively segregated in terms of living. Most black students live in South Campus. That's where they were going to build it, and that was kind of kept away and finally not decided because of a TA strike that was called, not with the support of the campus union, in December. So now Silent Sam's gone, the pedestal is gone. I think they could have left him like that. That's history too. It would have been interesting, but whatever. And now we've gone from the built landscape and symbols which are still important and still represent to me and reveal truths about what's happening, on the ground to a focus on police at UNC and abolishing the police unit at UNC and discovering truths about the police unit at UNC, which is relatively large. It's the 8th largest university police force in the country. I think bigger than University of Chicago's, NYU's, Duke's, similar universities. And that's of no coincidence, right? That's because there's a history of resistance at UNC, specifically black resistance. So, to me, it's kind of, I guess maybe I should end on the note that, it's to me very exciting throughout all this very depressing kind of history. A year ago, the idea of Silent Sam falling down was not very popular to, many students didn't know how to, tap into that or tap into anti-racist work. And we've gone from, we shouldn't have white supremacist monuments on campus to we should have police on campus. And I think that's a huge accomplishment for what a lot of people in Chapel Hill have been working towards. That's all.
This is The Final Straw. You've been listening to my little talk about resistance to racist symbols of white supremacy in the Triangle region of North Carolina. You can follow them on Twitter at Reed Kurputkin. Also, next up, Dwayne Dixon, an adjunct professor, will talk about resisting white supremacist militarism and symbols of the Confederacy. I'm joined by Dwayne Dixon to talk about anti-fascist autonomous organizing in the southeast of the so-called U.S. Thank you so much for joining me, Dwayne.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited.
Would you care to introduce yourself for the audience? Maybe give a little background about yourself and what you do professionally?
Yes, my name is Dwayne Dixon, and I'm a cultural anthropologist by training. My work is primarily in Japan, and I study young people and media and skateboarders, actually. I teach at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, where I've taught for a couple years. I'm an adjunct, which means that I don't have a permanent position in the university.
And do you care to give a little introduction about how you got into politics? Was it through cultural involvement through a music scene, or was it just purely philosophical or religious, or what?
Yeah, as most of us would agree or just kind of comprehend that politics are around us all the time. And I grew up in a very conservative Baptist military family, primarily in the Southeast, when I was young. And being exposed to politics from the pulpit, right, in these Baptist churches at the time when the moral majority under Jerry Falwell was really consolidating its power and beginning to mobilize evangelical Christians to elect Ronald Reagan to his first term in office. Explicit electoral politics were around me. I was exposed to really intense anti-abortion activism through the Baptist churches that my parents took me to and the Baptist schools I attended. And then just growing up on military bases, right? Politics, again, and wars and the preparation for wars around you all the time with very real consequences to, my father in that case. So I think, just the books that were in the house and what I was exposed to through the Christian schools I attended and the churches, and then just living amongst soldiers really laid a foundation for many of the things now that I guess I would say that I struggle against. But it was a real powerful preparation and difficult sometimes to kind of come into my own being. But certainly by the time I was 13 or 14, as a kid, I'd wanted to go to West Point. I wanted to imitate my father and be, an airborne ranger. And I had this kind of epiphany. I don't have one singular consolidated moment, but there was definitely a period where I was like, whoa, war is really bad. It had been somewhat fantastical, even though, of course, I was exposed to its material stuff all around me. And then it changed, and I don't know in what I was reading. And I was really pro authoritarian violence. I still can remember this drawing. I was always an avid drawer, and I drew a drawing of a police officer in riot gear, and I wrote urban guerrilla on it. I must have been 11 or maybe 10, and I remember putting it up on the corkboard in my bedroom. I was totally fascinated by and celebrated these really hyper-masculine demonstrations of state power, basically. I mean, that sounds like such a really harsh gloss or analysis of myself, but yeah, I was really into power and weaponry and military authority and force. Yeah, and then something just shifted. Yeah, and I just started going to the library, the Army Post Library, and I'd go to the card catalog and look up communist or hippie, anything I thought was words that I knew were out in pop culture that somehow signified everything that I wasn't exposed to. So, but the real political turn that was really profound for me, I remember I was setting up a new skateboard in my bedroom. So I was putting the grip tape on the top of this new deck, and it had NPR on. So I was 15, and there was a broadcast, a news report about teenagers uprising in Soweto in South Africa. This is under apartheid, so that kind of dates me, right? So this is the mid 80s. And yeah, it was just whoa, they're kids like me, and they're getting it. They're really stepping to those urban guerrillas, right? The riot police that I had celebrated not that long ago. These young people are going after these armored vehicles and these riot police, and with very little defense or anything, just their bodies, they're putting themselves on the line. And then I started doing more reading about apartheid. I already knew quite a bit about the Rhodesian Bush Wars, and a lot of anti-colonial struggles, but I had been reading for all that stuff from the side of white power, effectively, right? Just from the nation state. And so my consciousness was totally flipped around or inverted. Now I was struggling and seeking out things to read about them, not as if the people fighting for liberation were these lawless creatures, really, because that's the way they were always depicted in the sort of dominant texts that I was exposed to or that I was reading as a young person. But now reading stories about them through their eyes, as if for what we would all see is that they were fighting for freedom. And what that meant was that I had to completely reorient and reevaluate and reinterpret my entire worldview. I mean, it was really disruptive. It really forced me to just every book that I consumed about the French Foreign Legion, or about the story about an American sailor on one of the first naval expeditions against the pirates at Tripoli. These really intense stories that I had bonded with as a young kid, I now had to read as exactly what they were: expressions of nascent American military power, of imperialism. Just all these things now that I've come to recognize as so violent and bloody, exploitative and racist. So that NPR broadcast about the teenagers in this township, going up against Afrikaners riot police was a catalyst. It really forced this sharp alteration and reevaluation of who I was, right, at 15 years old. So I guess as a kind of condensed version, then I was involved in hardcore punk and skateboarding. Both of those worlds taught me a lot about my own body and also the way police interact with bodies that are unruly. And of course, being in punk and in a kind of underground scene in the 90s, I just was reading copiously, both sort of above ground presses, but then zines, and just meeting people and traveling and all those things, both in the United States and then later in Asia. I just learned a lot and tried to absorb as much as I could about the way people created meaningful lives for themselves amid what I saw increasingly as really intense oppression and kind of suffocation of people's individual creative liberties, but then also their collective power to build worlds for themselves.
Wow, that's a really good answer. It's interesting. I mean, just a sort of a hot take off of one thing that you said, and because I feel like there's a generational gap around this, the white Afrikaner or Southern African quote unquote resistance movements. I guess they were resistance movements that were armed or bolstered by mercenary white supremacist groups that would go around internationally. It's like an interesting footnote in history that I'm slightly younger than you, and so I remember that. It's in my memory, and mostly like I remember white nationalists poking towards that and being like, that's a thing like we need to aspire to. And it never ended with that. Like, white supremacist mercenaries have gone abroad at different points to like since the Vietnam War, at least, to gain training and armaments and like bring the war home, as like one book is aptly titled. But as we're talking right now, we just passed the, I think, 4th anniversary of the Charleston church shooting, the AME, by Dylan Roof, who also like at I guess not at one point, but he didn't seem to come to that point that you came to of like thinking, like being fascinated by this sort of like white entitlement, white power, like violence, even if you didn't put it in those terms necessarily, but he seemed to like go farther with that mythos and try to embody it. And it's a kind of historical point that, like I said, generationally, it feels like only younger people that are into that are like explicitly white power people, as opposed to people that were around the discussions of ending apartheid in South Africa. I don't know. Just sort of like a.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. I mean, right, like generationally, like, I don't know, right? I mean, of course, your point is well taken, because that is a somewhat more subterranean history that, you know, Dylan Roof clearly was more invested in terms of exploring. But yeah, I think, for me, I think what's important, it's obviously it's built into the kind of lived experience of my reality, but it's important for us all to note, and I know that About Face, the organization of leftist war veterans, is also really invested in this, is just pointing out the historical continuities and connections, which for many folks listening, I'm sure is really familiar terrain, but to remind ourselves to something you just alluded to, which is right after the Vietnam War, well, actually, American GIs who had fought in Vietnam, of course, against a freedom movement, came home, a few of them, and then sought out other opportunities to use their skills. And they had a very ideological framing for that, and that the white Rhodesian forces that had been mustered to maintain white power over that colony included some American War and Vietnam veterans. So, you know, GIs, Marines and infantry that had fought in the jungles of Southeast Asia, then came back to the US and then ended up finding work, essentially, in the name of white supremacy, yet again elsewhere in the world, but within this larger constellation of white supremacist outposts, nations, attempted colonies, puppet governments, whatever sort of framing we want to put on it. We all understand that all of those names conceal at its core this deep masculinist, patriarchal, white supremacist form of authoritarianism and power. And yeah, it just, you know, it's really jarring, because, you know, I grew up at a time where those t-shirts that say "kill them all, let God sort them out," this like 80s Rambo celebration of the military, now I can recognize was in its ascendancy after the humiliation that the American military had suffered at the hands of anti-colonial forces in Vietnam. And so this, you know, and Rambo, the film, is completely rife with this, right, as a mythological departure point. But I grew up in that era of those kinds of t-shirts, of going to the Army-Navy store and buying Soldier of Fortune magazine, you know, and being totally fascinated. I mean, wow, it's like, you know, and I think this is also important, not that this is a confessional, but to point out, like, you know, many of us struggle to arrive at points far removed from where we might have began. Like, I grew up in a household where my dad had Waffen-SS history books, right? Like photo documentary books given to him by West German officers, German officers. There were 2 of them, and they were these really graphic illustrations of Waffen-SS, right, this elite Nazi unit, its military prowess. And at the last chapter of both of those books were these really horrific photographs of concentration camps. And it took me a long time to figure out that all the stuff that I was valorizing and completely immersed in all the previous chapters, of Waffen-SS military power and supremacy on all these different battlefields from North Africa to the Russian front, all culminated in these camps where there are stacks of corpses. My dad had a Nazi helmet next to his paratrooper helmet and his West Point cadet hat. It was right there on this kind of display table thing that he had. And so in the world that I was in, these things were kind of equivalent. They were on different sides, but they weren't wrong. I mean, my grandfather bombed Nazis, but the ideological framing that would make this elite military unit also capable of genocidal violence. Making the linkage there was something I had to do, wasn't something that my dad ever talked to me about. And it's a failing that I put on my father. What the f***? How could these things be commensurate? This is a false equivalency. But then maybe not. I mean, that's the really chilling answer, is that militaries, this is in their genetic coding, in their cultural coding, to all have this capacity. And I think, in this kind of journey, this was this shock, and it's not a singular shock. It's a shock that I keep having throughout, my entire life, that things are disrupted, that kind of power that we are all confronting, we discover new facets of it, and also are reminded, often in really painful and bloody ways, that this is what it's comprised of, right? That rehabilitation of these kinds of forces is impossible. So those Soldier of Fortune magazines that I was buying and, really being invested in their kind of fantastic, exotic narratives that they presented are this surface screen, I guess, is a good way to think of it, that once passed through leads one, a white male reader, into these very dark sort of trenches of virulent white supremacist violence. That it really, these magazines, these narratives, especially in the 80s, really did do a lot of ideological work, I think, to create a foundational bed that we see continuing to act on white men. Like Timothy McVeigh certainly was a product of these narratives, and then Dylan Roof, and countless others, to various degrees. But that underneath this surface of militarism, there is this really kind of septic pool that white men particularly are encouraged to bathe in and drink from, right? To really create an identity for themselves that comes out of war making, and not just war making for its own sake, although that is certainly part of it, I think, to have it be, ideologically deracinated, but that there's an ideology behind it, and it's one of, settler bloodshed and the maintenance of white power, white supremacy.
So, fittingly, my next question was going to be about the organizing that you do. So the reason that your name came up to me at all is because of the visibility of you in anti-racist organizing around the southeastern so-called U.S. So this conversation that we're having right now is going to be paired for an episode alongside of Maya Little's presentation on racist neo-Confederate monuments and the white nationalists who love them, as well as the resistance to them around Silent Sam, for instance, at UNC Chapel Hill's campus and around the region. It was a really good presentation that happened at the North American Anarchist Studies Network conference in Atlanta earlier last month. But as a white person at UNC and a professor there and a community member, can you talk about your experience of the struggle against the monuments and the pushback that you've seen, or the complicity in the movement against them in the community, sort of the tensions?
Yes, and right, as anyone would imagine, it's really complex. So Maya has been extraordinarily involved in the removal of Silent Sam from the Confederate monument at UNC Chapel Hill. But a year prior, the Confederate monument that stood outside the old county courthouse in Durham County, which is the county right next door to UNC, was toppled by protesters just a few days after the white supremacist riot in Charlottesville, Virginia on August 12, 2017. So the Tuesday following that Saturday, that momentous Saturday, when Heather Heyer was murdered by a white supremacist Nazi, people in Durham pulled down that Confederate statue. And then a few days after that, the Klan threatened to come, and there was a big mass mobilization. Thousands of people in the city of Durham took to the streets in an all-day mass occupation, really, of the city streets that denied the possibility of any kind of gathering to white supremacists who had threatened to move on the city. So, Durham was engaged, activists in Durham were engaged for a year in a whole series of actions, a lot of court support, but a lot of anti-prison protests, May Day protests. There was a lot of just like fever in the city. Like, it was very intense and profound that the white supremacist sheriff, who has since lost his position through election, he was very aggressive in pursuing anyone he saw as a, quote, communist, which, I'm reading as code for anti-racist and not supporting his notion of law and order, which, of course, is a white supremacist version of that. So the city, Durham, was really aflame, and there were some actually very good independent journalists that were covering things in the city regularly, and I was really involved in that work, and in fact was part of the legal block for that action and subsequent actions. So all the activists in Durham learned a lot of lessons. There was some overlap then with activists and people who were based at UNC. The weird thing is a week after Charlottesville, I was supposed to begin a new position at UNC. I had left Duke University and was going to start a new job at UNC. I actually missed the faculty meeting on Friday following Charlottesville, August 12th, because the Klan threatened to come to Durham. And I was busy doing that, confronting that problem rather than being on campus. So that kind of followed me to UNC. So, I had weapons charges on me, put on me by the sheriff for being armed basically in the street the day that the Klan came. And so then there was a lot of pressure by certain elements within the university to get me fired, to annul my contract, and I was targeted, in a pretty ill-thought but energetic Nazi conspiracy campaign, and two fascists sort of jumped me outside of my office at UNC in February, the day before my trial in Durham for weapons charges. So the events of Charlottesville, the events in Durham, then carried over to the UNC campus, and the things that were happening to me specifically as an individual were happening in parallel to a wider ongoing action against Silent Sam, which I'm sure Maya has talked about. And the activist students there had been leading a very robust movement to remove that statue, and really, though, call attention to the wider confluence of white supremacist power that had been nurtured on the campus through the actions of the administration and through the force of the campus police. So, I think in early March, there was a big anti-fascist rally on campus, and this began to kind of coalesce elements of Durham activism, or the Durham activist community, with students at UNC, and also drawing in other activists, anarchists, anti-authoritarians from around central North Carolina. So it really was very organic. I'm sure the State Bureau of Investigation, who undoubtedly will also be listening to this podcast, will be trying to reconcile their own analysis with what I'm saying. And hopefully they're realizing, as what we already know, is that these movements really have taken on a powerful life of their own, that they aren't singularly directed by any one person or one organizing committee or one cadre, that they really have been sustainable and powerful because of the way that they have built on a wide large number of people's commitment to defeating white supremacy, to confronting it and shutting it down. And one of the most powerful and potent ways that has been demonstrated is by pulling it down, by taking those two statues down a year apart. So North Carolina, and this part of North Carolina, is incredibly potent in terms of its organizing capacity, but even more so for its ethical courage, I think. And Maya certainly symbolizes that, but there are many people who've committed themselves in the streets and to just doing the really grunt work of keeping things organized, keeping track of people's court appearances, organizing for security, for food, and just developing a lot of different skills that people have needed in order to stay safe and also to be able to mass themselves in really effective and oftentimes celebratory ways. Sometimes, unfortunately, those celebrations have been disrupted by neo-Confederates and the police, but that's also a contingency we've always taken into account. So we seem to deal with those pretty well as well. So yeah, it's important to note or recognize how the movements have grown and coalesced and reformulated, and that also it's made it sustainable, so that the burden, Maya specifically has borne a pretty heavy burden, as well as a few other people, in terms of energy outlay and also visibility, which comes with a lot of risks. But a wide number of people have really stood up to power, both in terms of the police, confronted white supremacists out in the streets, but also challenging the administration at every turn. So undergraduates and graduate students alike have shown themselves to be incredibly ingenious and also really committed to resisting and defeating white supremacy on campus.
This is the Final Straw radio show, and you're listening to UNC adjunct Professor Dwayne Dixon talking about resisting white supremacy and creating new communities and autonomous force to resist the existent.
I think it's really interesting, to just sort of zoom out from the Triangle experience. Triangle / Charlottesville, since that was also about it's centered around, in some way, a Confederate monument and city council or certain city council members taking the lead based on popular pressure to remove some of those symbols of Confederacy. But zooming out and seeing the dialogue and the movement also just in the wider region, with pressure and direct action in Memphis, Tennessee, and all sorts of towns around rural Western North Carolina, in Florida, in New Orleans. It's pretty impressive how infectious the not that this is a new thing, as Maya pointed out in the discussion, people have been pushing back against these monuments being in their lives and imposed upon them, just probably since they've come up, but at least since the 60s, very visibly. But it's pretty inspirational, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I've heard, typically liberals be well, it's just a statue, or it's just a relic of history, just let it stand, whatever. And I don't want to concede any part of our shared experience of private or public space. In fact, those boundaries are not so useful for me to think about, and these spaces that operate underneath the supposed power of the state should be the most vulnerable to the people's desire for freedom. So taking back the literal air, relieving the air of those statues that they can't penetrate and hold themselves upright in our public view, I think is really generative and substantial, and it allows for new ideas and new forms of congregation to occur. The one point, though, that I would argue, and I know that Maya and others agree, is that the statues, while a really powerful focal point, are not the horizon or the limit of our desire. So just because they come down, obviously, doesn't mean that white supremacy has also been ushered from the building. And so what task lies before us is often more complicated, but it's to root out not these static material objects that represent white supremacy, but to go after the cultural and social production of white supremacy. How are these forms of inequality and oppression so deeply integrated one, into systems, but two, into our daily individual lives and practices. And, as a white person, I think it's so incumbent for us as white people, obviously, to check ourselves and then to speak up and challenge other white people, and not in a call-out sort of way, but recognizing that people are on a journey and that they're struggling. I don't think that we have much room or should have patience for purity politics, because we all came from somewhere that probably wasn't so great. And that was, for me, as a homophobic, creationist, patriarchal little warmonger, essentially, right? Like, that was how I was raised, and it's taken effort on my part and a huge amount of effort, and I'm the beneficiary of a huge amount of labor from other people of color, to really, work with me and challenge me and force me to confront things that were really uncomfortable and painful and that I resisted. And so I think for us white people, to really seek out and try to destroy the ways in which we have been trained into believing, often so just through habit, that that whiteness is at the center of the universe, is a real struggle. We know this for ourselves, and it's important that we then also confront it in our daily lives, but in a way that's also built out of compassion and patience. I have no patience for Nazis, and if someone's going to come for me or someone that I love or anyone, I have no hesitation to resist them. But in other ways, I think it's really important for us to work to try to encounter people in their daily lives where they are and try to turn them. And I realize, like, this is delicate, and in no way am I advocating for one singular tactic, and I want to be really clear, like, I'm not apologizing for anyone's white supremacy or for their hatred. Like, all that stuff needs to be challenged and confronted. But I think it's really important to have at our disposal all these different tactics, and also to recognize, like, in order to change the cultures that we live in, we really have to engage people that in ways that are maybe going to be really difficult, and encounter people that are going to be really unpleasant and really recalcitrant, like just fucking stubborn. And that takes a lot of patience, and that's, I think, at least for me, that's a task that I want to take on, and isn't really important, because that's not a job, of course, that people of color should ever have to do, right? Like, of course, they can take care of themselves, but, like, I want to make the world better for all of us, so I need and want to, like, challenge white supremacy in these sort of daily, habitual ways. And, it's really important that faculty fucking speak up in faculty meetings, that faculty take on some of the burden of this and go challenge the administration, that they fucking risk something. And I think that's something that, I've really been noticing and also really disappointed in, but not surprised by, is how cowardly so many white people are.
I think there's a creativeness to the destruction of that white supremacist culture that we attempt to engage, because by doing that, we are also creating a cultures of resistance, or cultures of, like, alternative, cultures of like stepping back and listening. I'd like to talk about, like, sort of shifts that this wider dialogue has been a part of, in terms of, like, unsettling colonial society, engaging with and calling out anti-blackness and white supremacy as it exists, and trying to build alternatives to it, and these, like, longer term ways of resisting, like, patriarchal capitalism. So, like, in the last few years, maybe that's just kind of a jump for, like, an introduction, but, like, the last few years, we've seen, like, a growing autonomous, anti-racist, and anti-capitalist organizing within the South and Southeast of what's the so-called U.S., and a lot of it has been actively challenging. A lot of it's been coordinated by anti-capitalists, by autonomists and anarchists, and it's been in response to, like, the social disasters imposed by the state, and the, like, cultural crisis of white supremacy and patriarchy, and also the natural disasters that are exacerbated by capitalist-driven climate change. I wonder if you have any words you want to say about, like, how you've seen that energy that's been coming up, a lot of ways, the same energy that brought people to Standing Rock to, like, be in support of that struggle, or the J20, or the struggle against fascists in the streets throughout the United States. How you've seen that expand, like, the same day as the the Silent Sam statue came down, there had been like a raucous demo that was organized actually by prisoners in eastern North Carolina one day before the start of the second nationwide prison strike that this decade has seen, which is pretty inspirational. Can you talk about like cross-pollination between movements and where you see the energy lying or going from there?
Yeah, I think this is, for someone my age and my generation, this is the most profound and effective moment of social organization and people's power that I've ever witnessed. Like some of my really most profound moments of like political mobilization were like, against the IMF, for example, in DC. So, and having been really inspired by the battle in Seattle, the movement against the WTO and anti-globalization struggles throughout the world. And I've seen things happen in other places, in other countries, armed resistance, just people's movements, and also having studied those movements in other parts of the world, but also recognizing how narrowly they were often focused. One of the things I teach in university is the beginning of the post-colonial nation states of Asia. And, it's really instructive that the thing that has galvanized so many anti-colonial struggles became the vision of a nation, and that communists and autonomists were often absorbed, as were really powerful religious positions and religious figures were absorbed and captured under the umbrella of a nation state, and that often that these visions of the nation were promulgated by the local bourgeoisie who had been trained by the colonists. Not always, but frequently in North Africa and in Asia, in the Middle East. It was often this one sort of more centrist, if we want to use this spectrum. These are the people that were able to galvanize and harness all this people's energy for freedom, coming from so many different ideological positions and vantage points, but it was the mirror projection of the nation state as a way of reconstituting this population that were now sort of stripped, so to speak, of any kind of visibility or meaningfulness once the colonial shackles had been like smashed or broken off. And so looking at the way these many different kind of people's movements have either been rerouted or have been hampered or simply like chosen to have their energies run a certain kind of circuit, and then thinking of course about the United States and its histories with popular resistance going all the way back to really like colonial times, but into the more contemporary moment of the 60s, obviously, and environmental struggles. Like, this is really profound. So the pollination that you talked about is significant. I think that more people have been drawn into movements now, partially because white supremacy is something that can be named and talked about in a way that's very explicit and allows people to take a side in a really like strident way. Doesn't mean that everybody's going to necessarily have a wide range of analysis, but if asked, people will make a choice about whether they support one thing or the other. Usually if they're a racist and they're being engaged, they're going to obfuscate, which immediately, reveals their position. So in the sense that we're able to draw in a lot more people, I think that there's a lot of power to be gained from that, but I'm also concerned that people, sort of average everyday people, still oriented towards electoral change. And even as there have been these popular people's movements to, say, interrupt fracking or oil pipeline construction, like in Louisiana or at Standing Rock or in Virginia, West Virginia, that incarcerated people have been very mobilized and uprising, that all sorts of people, say in Durham, have been mobilized to take down a statue and then, resist the state locally for a really sustained period of time. So there are all these intersections. Average people still, I think, struggle to find a way to make those struggles their own. and I hesitate to say connect to, because I don't want it to seem like these are like these individual pockets or poles of mobilization or organizing that people have to go seek out and find. Like, I want average everyday people to make struggles their own. And I feel like while there has been a really massive upsurge of people's power, demonstrations of people's power in the Southeast, I'm still concerned, and I guess this echoes what I just said about, white faculty at UNC, for example, not really being engaged. They're just watching from the sidelines, and I suspect just, exerting a lot of keyboard anxiety into the ether worlds of Facebook and writing, I don't know, letters to whomever, right? The chancellor, to an editor at a newspaper. I mean, they're still in these much older models of confronting power, which I hesitate to even say that's really confronting, right? They're just participating in a kind of ritual exchange. And so, there has been a lot of coalescing of power and people's energies, in confronting ICE, challenging. Right now, there's, activism happening around challenging this legislative bill that's in the North Carolina state legislature, which would require sheriffs to cooperate with federal immigration authorities and to essentially be their shock troops, their primary agents, and round up people for deportation. And so there's activism in challenging that, but people have been working to, interdict and interfere with ICE's smooth operation in North Carolina and elsewhere. And these are all, connected struggles, right? I don't think anyone who's involved in any one of these in a really deep way would be ignorant of the ways that one movement is interconnected with all the other. And so that interconnectedness is something that I've never seen so profoundly taken up by such a large number of people. And that's really heartening, that's really inspiring. And then at the same time, like, I just am concerned that there are so many people who are aware and are smart and are reading a lot and yet aren't doing anything. And I think they're still waiting for something. And I just urge all of us to stop waiting. Like, it's time to stop talking about it and to start doing it. And we've have these amazing examples of what doing it can actually produce. I mean, it's just a slogan, do it like Durham. And as you pointed out, right, it just isn't maybe the singular example, but it was one of several that propelled so many other spaces to challenge the legitimacy of their Confederate monuments that had been haunting their particular spaces. And so I think once you start doing stuff, to hark back to something you just said a few minutes ago about confronting white supremacy, it's like you start creating new cultures, because really that's the change. Like, once you start organizing, you start building those friendships, those relationships, you start figuring out ways of self-governance and confronting the hard work of, conflict and friction, disagreement, and tactical diversity and challenges. Wow, like, as an individual, I think you become more resilient, and certainly the camaraderie and care that people begin to take, the investments they begin to make in one another, are no longer mediated by the normative construction of wider society, right? And that's what we would hope for, so that then it's like you're engaged with people on their terms, and you're taking up their struggles on their terms, and then also drawing in their energies for struggles that are important to you in your specific locality. And that form of solidarity is so precious to us, right? That's such the wellspring of our joy, is to see ourselves reflected back in all the struggles around us, so that when prisoners are uprising, I'm uprising with them. And when I step in the streets to do something, I carry their spirit with me. And that is like a really deep and profound way to live your life. That's so richly liberating. It's just like, it just smashes the chains of thinking you need to wait for someone else to give you the program, the schematic, the blueprint, the authorization to get yourself fucking free.
Well, Dwayne, I think that's a lovely note to end on. Thank you very, very, very much for having this conversation. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope that we get to chat again a little bit longer next time. Yeah, you profess well, Professor.
Yeah, I hope it's an avocation rather than just a profession. But yeah, thank you so much. This has been really, I would say, enjoyable. It sounds so bourgeoisie. It's been such an enjoyable chat we've had. But no, like getting down is just like such a happy thing to do. And so I really appreciate this time that you've made for us to share these ideas.
Absolutely. Is there a way that folks in the listening audience can follow any of the like writing that you're doing, or do you have like a social media presence that you want to point people to, or maybe just see you in the streets?
I am one of the people who manage Piedmont Red Strings, which is a Facebook page, so people can go there, defend UNC, Take Action Chapel Hill. Take Action Chapel Hill is also one of the main organizations that I'm involved in, and that's the sort of collection of activists who've been mobilized around Silent Sam or taking down Silent Sam. So they can also find stuff that I'm working on over there.
Can you thumbnail the like the Red Strings reference for listeners that might not know?
Yeah, so Piedmont Red Strings is a community defense formation or organization. It's dedicated to teaching people the skills that they need to defend themselves and their communities in the face of oppression, but also to think about mutual aid and disaster relief as well.
Thank you very much, Dwayne.
Thank you.
We're excited to announce that The Final Straw can now be heard on Fridays from 6 to 7 a.m. on WGDR, 91.1 FM out of Goddard College in Plainfield, Vermont, as well as in Eugene, Oregon on KEPW 97.3 FM on Saturdays from 9 to 10 p.m. local time. Literally a coast-to-coast edition of The Final Straw. Anarchist organizer, former Black Panther, and in some ways founder of the modern anarchist Black Cross movement, Lorenzo Komb'oa Ervin is seeking solidarity funds for medical needs. He and his equally inspirational wife, Jonina Ervin, would like help in covering medical costs concerning Lorenzo's chiropractic needs, and the two are working-class elders on fixed incomes, suffering from the bureaucracy of the Veterans Affairs, holding back funding. You can find out more, read Lorenzo's appeal, and donate at gogetfunding.com/funding-medical-care-for-Lorenzo-Ervin. We had the pleasure of speaking with Lorenzo about anti-police organizing in Memphis, Tennessee some years back, and we'll link that conversation in our show notes. The Final Straw Radio is also a member of the A Radio Network, an international web of anarchist and anti-authoritarian radio shows, podcasts, and pirate radio stations around the world. We just released our monthly English language podcast, BADNews, Angry Voices from Around the World, and we're putting it up on our website in our podcast stream. But you can also find it, along with past episodes and more about the network, at a-radio-network.org. So now an announcement from the Tiny House Warriors via Sparrow Media to the policy decisions by the Trudeau government. And this was released on June 18th and can be found at sparrowmedia.net. Quote, "The Tiny House Warriors responded to today's official approval of the Trans Mountain Pipeline by insisting that it will never be built on Secwepemc land, which includes 50% of the proposed pipeline route. The Tiny House Warriors are a group of Secwepemc land and water defenders who for the past year have been gathered in a new village of tiny houses on Secwepemc territory near Blue River. Their village site is along the proposed pipeline route and just across from a planned 1,000-man camp for pipeline construction workers, and they are insisting that they will not allow either the man camp or the pipeline to be built on their territory. Quote, "The Trudeau government does not have the right to put a pipeline through unceded Secwepemc land," unquote, says Kanahus Manuel, a spokesperson for the Tiny House Warriors. Quote, "To try to legitimize this illegal act, Canada uses what legal scholars called cunning misinterpretation of consent, which is inconsistent with Indigenous constitutional and international laws," unquote. Continuing on, "The fact that they have a few sellout Indian Act chiefs supporting their pipeline in no way legitimizes it. The salaries of these sellouts are directly paid by the Department of Indian Affairs, and they have no right to speak for the people who are the rightful title holders of the land. The same goes for the idea of selling this worthless pipeline to Indigenous people and using Indian trust monies to back this up. This is merely trying to put a brown face on the rape of our land. We will not allow that to happen. And while the United Nations is today looking into the genocidal murders of Indigenous women and girls uncovered by the MMIWG report, we will not allow Trans Mountain Pipeline to insert a man camp of 1,000 white men into our territory to continue and even accelerate the genocidal rape and murders of our women and girls. Today we are calling on all our Indigenous and non-Indigenous allies to join us in this battle to ensure the man camps are not built and that the Trans Mountain Pipeline will not pass." Unquote. You can find out more about this struggle at the website tinyhousewarriors.com, and you should give a listen to a recent episode of the It's Going Down podcast, or IGDcast, that can be found at itsgoingdown.org. It's This is America number 75, Native People Are Using Tiny Homes to Fight a Pipeline. This was recorded or released on May 29th, so it's a little out of date in terms of this specific decision by the Trudeau government. However, it is an interview with Kanahouse Manuel about the Tiny House Warriors project. This is The Final Straw, and I'm Bursa Goodness. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw Radio, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned co-op in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a catalog of Firestorm's books and zines, plus a full calendar of events up at their website, firestorm.coop.